living in harmony with nature's patterns. So, shifting gears again. That was great. We went through there. There's all these patterns, a little bit more depth. But that's still, I don't think, good enough. It's not going to get us to design with patterns. We've got to be able to utilize patterns in our design. If not, what is permaculture design? Just words. So patterns are what we're doing. So this is a master plan. Do you see the garden? It's the white negative space. So they didn't color in the plants. So the path is the tree. The dendritic pattern is the pathways for the garden beds. So once the garden beds grow in, it would be a tree. So they stylized a tree. So living in harmony with nature's patterns is basically what master plan design is about. Creating patterns for us to live with nature. So we're going to try to see if we can go through that. So lots of patterns in nature. And we can study these patterns. The astronomers, physicists, biologists, and doctors, and geologists, and they like to label them. So this is a concentric pattern. If you use circles, concentric patterns, when we throw, the media is dispersed to the outside. Tends things to end up on the outside. That could be beneficial, but it might not be what you want to happen. You may want things to accumulate into the center. Like, for instance, if you had a concentric pattern around the sala, everybody would tend to end up on the peripherals, not in the sala. Or you could have linear, which we call nodal patterns, that would bring people into the sala. These are different of what you were trying to achieve. So concentric is growth through accretion. This is how trees, so this is a utilized pattern, but remember the tree is always trying to reach out. So what are you trying to do? Other patterns will draw in. Nets, very good in control. We see them all throughout. That's also in the top right-hand corner, if you'd like to know, that's the internet. So that's the three-dimensional pattern of all of the servers in the world. We can use that, and there's another three-dimensional on the bottom left-hand corner of the internet. But we can use the pattern or nets to create flow diagrams. And flow diagrams, when we get tomorrow into our actual more practical application of master planning through methods, is a method that we can use to see and graph the interactions of flow. Remember the outputs to the inputs? And we can see relationships. So we utilize the technique to find the relationships so that we know where to place elements. So there's a permaculture, the kind of bigger up-hand left, and then there's overlaps of permaculture. Organic gardening definitely would overlap with permaculture. There's some kind of overlap there, right? Permaculture is not organic gardening, nor is organic gardening permaculture, but there's a big relationship. Same thing with natural building. There would be an overlap. They're pretty much independent. Some people practice natural building have never heard of the word permaculture. But for sure, I believe as a permaculturalist that I would want to also practice natural building. I think there's overlaps. So we can then write the things that we believe in, and we can map those to find the relationships. That would then help us in our lifestyle choices or how we might want to design systems within our plan to accommodate those designs. Spiral growth. Our spiral patterns are really prevalent. We see them a lot, okay? And what do? They accommodate growth. So as we spiral, seed packets do this a lot. They utilize spirals in order to catch the really small seeds that grow out and spiral out with the growth of the plant. Lots of them in nature we can see all over. We can look at flow, turbulent flow from clouds or within water systems. So interlocking spirals, when we have interlocked turbulent spirals, it's called a Kármán or vortex streets. This is moving into how we develop the keyhole garden system. So permaculture keyhole gardens being a replica of vortex spirals, so or helixes. So that's an Ekman spiral. So Ekman spirals, it's a current of a structure of currents or wind near a horizontal boundary in which the flow direction rotates as one moves away from the boundary, if you want to be a scientist, or interlocked spirals. When we interlock spirals, the path of the interlock, that becomes the path, and the spirals are the keyhole gardens. So if we put keyhole garden beds along a sinuous curve, it is the model of a Ekman spiral that we can see in the sky and or inside of a water vortex. Ekman spirals can be seen in two planes, three-dimensionally, so we can see it in this plane above us, we can see it in this plane below us, and we can also see it horizontally, okay? So that's how we would design a windbreak. we understand that the turbulent flow of wind over a tree creates the spiral, right? And there's a mathematical relationship. So here we see the height of your tree, right? And this turbulent flow stops at around 8 times the height of the tree. If I was in a cold climate, I would want to place my house inside to be protected from the turbulence, meaning the cold north wind will not buffet my house, freeze me out. But if I was in a more tropical place where it was hot, I might want to design that the tree barrier actually increased the wind speed, and I had an increased wind flow at my house by placing my house further away from the windbreak. So one windbreak is actually protecting my garden, but increasing the wind flow to my home. The other windbreak would be protecting my home. And then you can see this. And those repeat at the same pattern, 8 times the height. Okay? So vortexes are a spinning, and they're often turbulent or a flow of fluid. So this spinning or flow of fluid, we can see this mostly in our weather patterns. It's very easy to see tornadoes, hurricanes. Vortexes are eddies within water. Spiraling vortexes, you could describe our DNA. We can see the cork tree as spiraling. And vortexes are described as healing agents. So this is Victor Schlossenberg, the Australian forester, that described, and prior to being able to study it, that water basically could heal itself through going through vortexes, lowering the temperature. So now you can actually purchase off the internet where people buy pieces of pipe. It's made out of copper. You cut your plumbing in your home. You hook it in. And when the water comes through that has been reasonably stagnated from the city, it goes through copper fins that spin it into a vortex, right? So before it comes out, a vortex hits you. Very similar to, did you notice that there were 2 types of shower heads when we did our sustainable homes? One of them went through a vortex and it oxygenated. And then you're being hit with oxygenated water. So some would, in this line of reasoning, believe that that oxygenated vortex shower head would have a higher energy state hitting you. So effects of flow, when we see this in a more physical landscape, we have ripples or turbulence. And that brings us into like the concept of crenulations. So crenulations are when we can see a physical form of effects of flow in plants. So plants crenulating their edge to create more edge, and they're deforming the surface, right? And when they deform or crenulate the edge, they get more volume in a smaller space. So we'll see how that, why they may want to do that in a second. Waves, they distribute and they propagate through, they transmit media outwardly. So that's is why we don't typically see permaculture designs, though when I'll show you some where people like to do sector analysis. People will do sector analysis in a circle, but practically you never see any farm laid out that way. So we don't lay out our farms in those concentric circles because it tends to disperse the media to the outward boundaries, when typically we want to actually bring the media in, because we might put our garden, for instance, in that center. So we want to bring the media from the outward bounds in, and we'll do that with nodal design. So lots of waves, lots of cloud forms, whether it's a coral in the ocean, replicating the cloud form we see in the sky, or in our head, our brains. So lobular is what that cloud form is described as. So the lobular increases edge. They said if you took your brain and they pull it out and it unfolds, it's about a 4x8 sheet of plywood. It's pretty big. And they take that and they crenulate it all together and stick it in your head. Imagine if you had a piece of paper that big and you had to fold it and try to put it in your head. It'd be really, really hard. So the lobular nature gets more surface area. The surface area is where the synapses are firing. So the more surface area you have, the more synapses are smart that you can be. So we see that in trees, brains, corals, spiders, vegetables, utilizing this technology, if you will. So lots of places to see lobular cabbage. So these are natural streamlines that we can see. And if we look up on the upper left, that's a streamline. That's trellising for grapes on contour. So not the French way, not down the hillside where you don't see any grass and all their topsoil and fertilization runs down the hill to the valleys below. No, not that way. On contour. See, I I think there was used to be French wine was the best. Maybe, how many years ago was that? 30 years, 40 years ago? They dominated, right? All of a sudden, people in this other country started to plant grapes in a different way. They started to plant grapes on contour. They started to do it differently, and they got really good at it. Australians, Americans, Chile. So they all plant it differently, guys. Think about that. They plant on contour. Contour is passive water harvesting. They get more water retention, and they don't get as much erosion. Better grapes equals better wine. So, you know, you can change or you can get left behind. You know what's more interesting? That same group started to say, well, you know what? We do grapes really good. What's that other thing they like over there in Europe and think they're really good at? Olive oil? Australians are planting olive oil on a huge scale. And guess what they're doing it on? Contour, utilizing streamlines. They're going to make better, cheaper olive oil. And the world needs that. More people want more olive oil, right? Price is pretty high. So these are the type of things where agriculture, utilizing energy capture, passive, we can see things change. So that's flow. Flow down a hillside, slowing it down, increasing the yield of the particular agriculture that you might try. Lots of streamlines. We can see them imparted on our fingertips, on animals. Lots of branches and networks all over. Pretty cool. Scatters is another pattern. Okay, we can see upward projections. Bamboo would be a scatter pattern. Okay, I utilize in an interior design, which I guess is design, right? A scattered pattern. The sala ceiling is really tall, guys. Probably actually you don't realize how tall it is. I put buildings inside of the building. I put posts with pots with branches poking up to make you look up. So when you look up, it feels shorter than if you won't look up, it just feels really tall. So these are ways that we can utilize patterns to elicit a response. So your response is you move your head up because you saw the pattern, which makes your head go up. So people can study our interactions with patterns. Landscape architects, designers of movement within a landscape, they understand our nature to interact with a pathway, for instance. So if we come to a narrowing pathway, we'll slow down. And when we leave the narrowing pathway, we actually increase our speed. So they can actually mess with the speed that we walk through a landscape by playing with the widths and patterns and calculate that. Nets, another one. So nets are all over, and at the top we see one called the net and pan. So this is in a situation in a drylands area like a desert. They have more people die in deserts of drowning than of basically dehydration per year because a rainfall event comes up away from them and a flash flood comes down. They're hiking or climbing inside of the wadis or gullies, right? Quite popular place to have recreational sports, and all of a sudden a flash flood comes down and they die. They didn't know it was coming. So in this instance, if we could slow down the flash floods, so this is a technique, people would go out, make these pans in a net formation. When the water came over, it would slow the water down. The sediments and silts will fall out of the water when it's slowed down. The water will stay into the nets, and then afterwards the people come out, plant the seeds, and they get a growth of food. So each rainfall event, they're able to slow down the water, sink it in order to facilitate growth. This is called the Overbeck jet mushroom, as we know. Also, the release of energy on a nuclear explosion creates an Overbeck jet. All men and women carry Overbeck jets. We carry it externally. Women carry it internally in their ovaries. And we have our phallic symbols. We can see Overbeck jets being formed. This is sand that has exploded out and then formed, and that made a geologic formation of a rock over geologic time. So that's now a rock. So we can see this movement of energy. This is the duality and balance in nature, nature being symmetrical. So when the release of energy comes, it makes a duality or a balance. Very similar pattern to the torus. So this is one half of the torus. The other half of the torus is what's like underground in the tree. The upward flow to the point of origin. The point of origin, or the seed point, right, is the point at the seed. So the power coming in and up. So there's always a balance and a duality. So all life is in motion all the time, okay? And so we can see that's us. When we're attached to the placenta, we form into this shape. Okay, looks like a little lizard guy. And we see that same shape in a tomato, in other fruits. So we can notice that, are we tomatoes? I don't know. What's the differentiation between the tomato and how we grow? We can look at somatics, which is energy is the cause, form is the effect. So this is a way of understanding energy makes the form. So energy causes this to happen, and the form that we see is the effect of energy flow. It took energy to make this. So when we look at our master plans and we start to see more nice master plans, I want you to start to appreciate that the design, the edges created into the design, creates the movement or limits, blocks, accepts the movement of energy, and that's going to create the effect of the design, the functional nature. What function your design does and how well it does something is how well it interacts with energy. We can see in art another form called testellations. We don't see this very much in nature. It's not a very utilized natural pattern. It does exist. We see it more so in art, but not as much in nature. So it's replicating tiles, okay, replicating a pattern. So like this here would be a testellation. They replicated a pattern. More so used in modern agriculture, they replicate the garden beds, right? But we don't see those types of replicated patterns that often naturally. Fractals, we do see a lot. And fractals are very handy when we're designing because we can design one small system and then interlock smaller systems to make a larger system. So I have one small water pot hooked to many water pots equals a large system. Yes?
You skipped a slide.
Explosions are a pattern. We see this in weeds. Weeds are the first successional grasses. So before weeds, so we have bacteria, fungi, what we know as weeds, first succession grasses. They tend to have an explosionary event where the relationship to their body and their root systems are out of proportion. That's typically driven by the carbon-nitrogen ratio. Fractals, systems inside of systems, or patterns inside of patterns. And these are handy to do. So we can use like a mandala. You could have a mandala inside of a mandala, inside of a larger mandala, this type of thing. Systems within systems. So fractus is a part. Find out one part and replicate the parts. In branches and diffusion, as I was talking about, we make pathways. So one of the major things in permaculture is to have your plan of your place. Let's say it's a square. The first step is to find the access point. How do I access the property? And from the access, I go to the different places. So pathways, whether they're roads, which can be hardscapes, they could be softscapes, things like maybe for tractor access, and we have pathways. This access creates the zonal nature or the edges. So access creating edge here, depending on how you make the access, dictates the speed at which the particles or media, us in this instance working through a pathway, is the media diffusion. So we can watch that where they put cameras in universities. They'll go up, do social experiments where they start to block the path slightly and watch the speed of the people change. Just a relationship to the pathway.